You already know how this ends. You park. You walk down with a box heavier than it needs to be. You get to the edge, plant your feet, and throw 50 feet out into the middle, because that's what the middle is for. 4 hours later, you walk back up the same path in the dark, and you tell yourself they weren't biting. I've watched anglers do that for years, and here's something it took me far too long to accept. The easiest fish of that whole day was probably inside 1 rod length of where you first stood. You walked past it going down, you walked past it coming back. You've got no boat, no screen to tell you where to start. You get 100 yards of bank and maybe 2 hours, and every wrong 100 yards costs 30 minutes you don't get back. That's the real problem with fishing from shore, and almost nobody talks about it. So here's the question. What if you could throw away most of the dead shoreline before the first cast, standing on dry ground, for free, with nothing but your eyes? We're going to walk one stretch of bank, the same walk you always make, 10 places you already know. But at each one I'll hand you something to read, and you carry it to the next. By the far end you'll be looking at the water you learned to fish on, and seeing something you've been standing on top of your whole life. One thing first, and again at the end. Rules change by state, and often by the lake. Check your state and local regulations before you go. We're not walking yet, we're still at the truck. Because there's a decision you make before your boots touch the bank, and most of us make it without knowing. One side of the water is chopped up and ugly with wind in your face. The other is calm and pleasant, and you walk to the calm side. Every time. That's not a fishing decision, that's a human decision. Here's what wind actually does to a bank, and it's been measured. On the shore taking the wind, wave energy strips fine sediment and plants out of the very shallow edge. Patricia Chambers published work on exactly that. Exposed shorelines end up with coarse, poor sediment. Sheltered ones collect the fine, rich stuff that settles out and stays. So on the windy shore, the useful edge gets pushed away from the bank, and it gets sharp. There's a line, and you can find it. On the calm shore, everything soft settles in close. Shallow. Uniform. No line at all. The comfortable bank is very often the bank with nothing on it to read. And one straight word, because this channel's only worth your time if I'm honest. You've heard that wind blows the food onto the windward shore. I couldn't find a solid freshwater source for that, so I'm not building anything on it. I'd rather hand you less and have it hold. So the first decision happens at the truck. Work out which way the wind's been blowing the last day or two, and walk toward that shore. Wind picks the bank. Now we walk. Stop. Don't step up yet. Look at the ground under your boots. Not the water. The ground. Everybody calls the undercut bank a hiding spot. Fish tucked under the lip, out of the light. True enough. But that's not the useful part. That undercut is a receipt. Something had to carve it. Water came in here over and over, for years, and took the dirt out from underneath. That's wind that's been working this bank a long time. Before you've made a single cast, the bank has told you which side of the lake you're on, the working side or the quiet side. And there's a second line on that receipt, right under your feet. Crouch down. Pick some of it up. Coarse and clean, gravel, cut edges, roots hanging in the air. This bank is being taken away, and it's telling you the truth about what's underneath. Fine and soft, with a ridge of drifted leaves pushed against it, this bank is being built. And a bank that's being built will lie to you about the bottom. Every time. Nobody ever told me that. I found it out the slow way, standing on soft ground wondering why the drop I could see with my own eyes wasn't there when I threw at it. So your first cast does not go to the middle. One quiet cast parallel to this edge. A small bait traveling within a foot of the lip. Watch your line for a twitch, an early stop, a sideways move. If it just drags bottom and loads up with leaves, move on. And carry that handful of grit with you. We'll need it twice more before this walk is over. 20 steps down, the tree line throws shade across the water. Beginners cast the middle of the shadow. Better anglers cast the edge where bright turns dark. Neither is what I want you to notice. Shade moves. The shade in front of you at 2 in the afternoon is not where it'll be at 6. It's on a schedule, and the schedule is written on the sun. A spot that's dead right now might be the best thing on this bank in 90 minutes, and you can be standing there when it arrives instead of finding out on the drive home. And here's the harder truth, the one that costs people entire afternoons. Shade over featureless ankle-deep water is just water that's nice to look at. Shade is a multiplier, not a thing. It multiplies whatever is already underneath it. Over a drop, over wood, over a weed edge, it's worth a great deal. Over nothing, it multiplies nothing. So, 2 casts, same speed and depth. One into the dark water, one crossing the light to dark boundary. If the crossing cast gets bumped near that line, work it from different angles. If both come back through bare shallow water, walk away. Second thing in your hands. Shade is a multiplier. Now the one everybody stops for. A tree in the water. Standard advice says fire at the outermost branches. That crosses the whole obstacle, hangs you up, and drags your bait away from the nearest fish. But here's what changed how I look at wood entirely. 2 fallen trees can look absolutely identical from where you're standing and be worth 10 times different. Same species. Same size, same angle into the water. One is a machine, one is firewood. The difference isn't the tree, it's what the tree is lying across. A tree that reaches out and crosses a line, an edge, a change, a drop, is stacking 2 kinds of cover at one address. A tree lying entirely inside a flat, shallow shelf is a pile of sticks in a pile of nothing. So find where the trunk crosses that change and put your bait there. Lower it beside the first big branch and watch how far it falls. Then do the same beside the bare bank a few feet away. If it falls further beside the wood, you've found a pocket. Which leaves one problem. I've just told you to find the line, and I haven't told you where the line is. There's a clue on a shoreline I trust more than almost any cover you can see. It's free, it's visible from where you're standing, and it only works when the water's clear enough. It's the next stop. Grass, pads, reeds, whatever grows on your water. The mistake is treating 100 yards of it as one target. What you want is the irregularity. A point sticking out, a pocket cutting in, a hole in thicker growth. True, and that's where every other video stops. It's also where the real answer has been hiding all along. The outer edge of a weed bed is a contour line drawing itself. Think about why plants stop. Not because they ran out of room, because they ran out of light. They grow down to the depth where light gives out, then they quit. Which means that ragged green line you can see from the bank sits at a specific depth, and that depth is not random. That relationship has been worked out. Patricia Chambers and Jacob Kalf published equations predicting how deep plants colonize, built from 8 lakes in southern Quebec, plus data from lakes worldwide. And the input is simply average summer water clarity. Daniel Canfield and colleagues at the University of Florida found the same thing independently, the same year. So, with your boots in the mud, tie something white to a string, a bottle cap, a jar lid. Lower it until you lose sight of it. Lose it at about 1.5 feet. The outer weed edge is near 3 feet. Around 3 feet of visibility, the edge is near 6. Around 6.5 feet, 10 or 11. Around 10 feet of visibility, 13 or 14. And now the part that goes against everything your gut says. The murkier the water, the bigger that multiplier gets. In dirty water, the edge sits close to twice your visibility depth. In clear water, more like 1.5. Read that again in fishing terms. Dirty water does not mean throw further to be safe. It means the whole living band has been squeezed shallow and close, and you should be casting shorter. Most of us do the exact opposite. We can't see anything, so we heave it as far as we can and spend the afternoon dragging a bait past everything that mattered. And there's one more turn in this, the one I'd write inside a tackle box lid. There are 2 weed lines, not one. The same work gives a separate depth for where growth is thickest, and it's meaningfully shallower than where plants finally stop. So the greenest, most alive-looking part of that bed, the part that pulls your eye and pulls your cast, is the inside of it. The line you want is out past that, where growth thins and opens into clean water, which gives you the most useful piece of feedback in this whole video. If your bait keeps coming back wearing a salad, you're not throwing the wrong lure. you're on the wrong line. Add 10 or 15 feet and change nothing else. Two honest limits. Those numbers come from temperate lakes using summer clarity, so reservoirs that swing water levels will drift off it, and a white lid on a string is a rough visibility gauge, not a scientific instrument. It sorts water into dirty, medium, and clear. That's all I ask of it. Third thing in your hands, and it's the biggest. The green line is a contour line. Now picture that fallen tree again. You finally know what it was lying across. Keep walking. Water coming in. A creek mouth, a culvert, runoff after rain. Everybody fires into the fastest water. The fish are usually beside it, letting the current bring them lunch. But here's why inflows matter in this video. Moving water is a slope machine. It digs a trench and piles a bar. It manufactures the exact change we've been hunting all morning, inside a few feet. So don't fish the flow, fish the bar at the edge of it. Now the rock, a wall of riprap holding a shoreline together. And everybody says the same four words: fish like the rocks. Fish don't eat rocks. They eat what lives in the gaps between them. Shelter is serious business down there. In the crayfish literature, shelter availability has been called the principal resource bottleneck for crayfish populations, going back to a suggestion by Horton Hobbs. And crayfish don't take any old hole. They pick shelter scaled to their own body size. In one European study on stone crayfish, the animals were found under stones at least about 3 times longer than the carapace of the crayfish underneath, with the biggest males holding the biggest stones. That's a European species in a stream, so take the mechanism, not the number. Bigger gaps hold bigger tenants, which leads straight to the thing you can see from the bank that nobody mentions. Riprap has an age. Rock that went in 30 years ago has silted up. The gaps are packed with fines, and the whole thing has quietly become a smooth, flat wall wearing a rock costume. Newer rock still has open holes in it. Same shoreline, same color from a distance, 2 completely different places to fish. So look for where the rock changes, where it stops, changes size, turns a corner, or runs into dirt or weeds. Fish both sides of it. If the whole wall is uniformly silted with no gaps showing, give it 2 casts and keep moving. Fourth thing in your hands. Cover has an age. Docks. Bank anglers do a strange thing at docks. We aim for the deepest looking outside corner and ignore the post close enough to reach with a flick of the wrist. That near post is shade sitting on a solid object, usually with a scour hole dug around the base by everybody stepping on and off. Try it first. Shaded side, then sunny side. But here's what matters more than any of that. A dock's value depends almost entirely on how many identical docks are sitting next to it. One beautiful dock in a row of 20 is close to meaningless. Every fish on that shoreline has 20 equally good addresses, so they're smeared across all of them, and you're playing a numbers game you cannot win with your legs. Which means the most valuable object on this entire lake might be something I haven't shown you yet. Hold that thought. Past the docks, the bank goes plain. No wood, no rock, no grass, just shoreline. And this is where most people quit reading the water and start heaving. The old advice says a steep bank keeps going down underwater, and a flat beach stays shallow a long way out. I used to repeat that. Then I read something that reorganized how I look at shorelines. Carlos Duarte and Jacob Kalf went out on Lake Memphremagog, on the Quebec and Vermont border, and measured what actually determines how much life grows in the shallows. Not the cover type, not the watercolor, not the season, the angle of the ground. In that lake, the slope of the shallow zone accounted for about 72% of the variation in how much submerged plant growth there was. Add in the organic matter in the sediment, and they were up around 88%. And when they took that model to other temperate lakes, it held up well. Sit with that a second, because it reorders your whole approach. The strongest single predictor of how much life is in front of you is a number you can estimate with your eyes, from dry land, in 3 seconds, for nothing. Their model worked better when they split shorelines at around 5 1/3% slope. On a bank, that's roughly 1 foot of drop for every 19 feet you walk out. A gentle 3 degrees. And be careful with it, because this is where people take a good number and ruin it. That was a breakpoint inside their statistical model, not a law of nature. Use it the way I do. To sort banks into two kinds. Gentler than that, and you get more growth and more forage, spread thin over a lot of shallow ground. Fish are scattered. Walk more, fan wider. Don't camp. Steeper, and you get less growth, but deep water comes right in against your feet, and everything compresses onto a narrow band. Stop walking, fish tight and parallel. Now here's the peak of this whole stretch, and it's where that handful of grit pays you back. The shoreline can lie to you. On an eroding bank, the slope above the water really does continue below it. But on a bank that's being built, the ground can look steep as a wall, while the bottom underneath is a flat silt shelf. You see a cliff. Your brain says, drop off. It's a bathtub. So before you trust a steep bank, look down. Coarse, clean, cut, sharp. Believe it. Fine, soft, with drifted debris piled against it. Don't believe it, no matter how steep it looks. And while we're standing on this plain, boring, featureless bank, I want to tell you about a man who stood on ones like it a long time ago. There was a high school physics and math teacher in Hickory, North Carolina, who could not let this problem go. He didn't have a screen, nobody did. Lowrance didn't exist until 1957, and the little green box, the first sonar most Americans ever laid eyes on, didn't reach people until 1959. Before that, if you wanted to know how deep it was, you tied a weight to a rope and dropped it over the side. So he did what a physics teacher does. He treated the lake as geometry. His name was Buck Perry, and a lot of people call him the father of structure fishing. And what he came to is the part almost nobody repeats, because at first it sounds like bad news. Fish don't live on the shoreline, they visit it. The bank is a temporary address, which means standing right here, you are never going to pick the spot where the fish are. I know how that lands, because it landed on me the same way. But stay with it one more second, because underneath it is the best thing anybody ever handed a bank angler. If the shoreline is where fish pass through, then you're not choosing a house. You're choosing a door. The man in the boat has to chase. You get to stand at the door and wait. That's not the consolation prize. That's a different way to fish, and it's the older one. Fifth thing in your hands, and it changes the other four. You are picking doors. And now look what's 100 yards further up, a narrow gap, the neck of a cove, the opening under a bridge, the end of a causeway. Most anglers hurry through those to reach the big open water beyond. 20 minutes ago, you might have two. But you just found out you're in the door business, and that is a door. Everything traveling this shoreline has to come through there, funneled into a lane you can cover from where you stand. So ask it one question with two casts. One across the narrowest part, steady retrieve. If that gets hit, the fish are moving, so keep the bait moving with them. Then one that pauses beside the first object, just outside the gap. If that's the one that gets eaten, they aren't traveling. They're sitting beside the exit, waiting for traffic. Slow everything down. Traveling or waiting. Two answers, two completely different ways to fish the next hour, and you got them for the price of two casts. Last stop, and it doesn't look like anything. 200 yards of plain bank. Nothing on it but one stump, or one rock, or one clump of grass with no business being there. Everybody's instinct is to walk past, because it's small and ugly, and there's prettier water somewhere else. Here's the rule, and then why it's the only thing you really need to remember. The value of any piece of cover is inversely proportional to how much identical cover is sitting around it. That's it. That's the whole video in one line. The beautiful dock in a row of 20 is worth almost nothing, because it's one of 20. This miserable little stump may be the most valuable object on the entire lake, because on this stretch of shoreline, it's the only edge that exists. Everything living here has one address, and you're looking straight at it. And notice what just happened. That one sentence eats the whole list. You don't need me to hand you 10 spots anymore. You can walk any shoreline in this country and grade it yourself. How much interruption is there, and how rare is it? So fish it properly, because you may only get one shot. Cast well past it so the splash doesn't land on top of it. Bring the bait close enough to brush it, then pause on the open water side and be ready, because that's where it happens. Nothing? 2 more angles, then go. But do not walk past it. Fish use the interruption, not the scenery. Everything I've handed you today is free except 2 things, and together they cost less than a sandwich. First, a visibility gauge, a white plastic lid or a bottle cap, tied to a string with a knot every foot. Lower it until you lose sight of it. That number tells you where the green line is. Second, a $2 slip float, and this one deserves far more respect than it gets. Set a bobber stop on your line, put a small weight under the float, cast it out. If the float lies flat on its side, you're too shallow and the weight's on the bottom holding it down. If the float disappears, you're too deep. Slide the stop until it sits up and rides properly. Then read your line. That's the depth, in real numbers. And that's what matters. It's repeatable. It doesn't care how heavy your lure is, what line you're running, or how hard the wind's blowing. 3 casts left, 3 straight out, 3 right, sliding the stop each time, and you've drawn a cross-section of the bottom without owning a single battery. And it isn't a hack. It's the direct descendant of the lead line, a weight on a rope. Exactly what everybody used before 1959. Nobody's getting rich off a $2 float and a plastic lid. That's not a conspiracy. It's just why you don't hear about them. So, 3 questions before your first cast. Not 10 spots. 3 questions. Which way has the wind been working? What's under my boots? Where does the green stop? And only then, is there anything sitting on the right side of that line? Wind, ground, green. Then the object. Most of us learned to fish from a bank. Somebody walked us down there and handed us a rod that was too big, a worm that was too long, and a lot of patience. And then somewhere along the way, we got told the bank was the beginner's version, the thing you leave behind when you get serious. I don't believe that anymore, and I don't think you should either. A boat lets you chase. A bank makes you read. Reading is the harder of the two, and it's the one still with you when the batteries are dead. Before you go, check your state and local regulations. Licenses, seasons, size and harvest limits, bank access and private property, bait rules, and the rules on moving live bait or live fish between waters. They change by state and often by the lake. And watch your footing on steep banks and wet rock. 2 things I want to hear about in the comments. Buck Perry would tell you the shoreline is the worst part of the lake. On your water, is he right or wrong? I've heard that argued hard both ways by people who catch a lot of fish. And second, have you ever given up the calm bank and stood out in the wind on purpose? What happened? I think that one splits a room. Next trip out. Before you walk down to the edge and throw 50 feet. Stop, and look down at your feet first. Everything I gave you today starts right there. It costs nothing, and nobody can take it off you.